Helena Blavatsky uncovered the Vatican's most terrifying secret. They feared the Anunnaki far more than Satan himself. The ancient tablets she studied revealed why religious authorities desperately suppressed evidence of these powerful beings who shaped humanity thousands of years before the Bible was written. What Blavatsky discovered wasn't just another historical footnote. It was evidence of an entire cosmic history deliberately hidden from public knowledge. For centuries, the Vatican maintained absolute control over religious narratives, warning of demons and the devil's temptations. But deep in their secret archives lay knowledge of something far more threatening to their authority. Ancient clay tablets describing beings called the Anunnaki, who created humans in their image. These weren't vague myths, but detailed accounts predating biblical stories by thousands of years. Blavatsky's discoveries during her travels throughout Egypt, India, and Tibet connected these dots in ways that terrified religious authorities. The founder of Theosophy pieced together fragments from ancient Sumerian texts that described creation stories identical to Genesis, except they were written centuries earlier and featured multiple creator gods rather than one. The Anunnaki weren't evil demons. They were advanced beings whose memory threatened the very foundation of monotheistic control. When Blavatsky published The Secret Doctrine in 1888, she directly challenged religious authorities by revealing these connections. Her work demonstrated that biblical stories weren't unique divine revelations, but adaptations of much older narratives. The Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, the Great Flood, all appeared first in Sumerian clay tablets, describing the Anunnaki's interactions with early humans. What makes this revelation so powerful isn't just historical curiosity. It fundamentally reshapes our understanding of human origins. The Vatican didn't fear the Anunnaki because they were demonic. They feared them because acknowledging their existence would reveal that biblical accounts were retellings of older stories, threatening the Church's claim to exclusive divine truth. The ancient clay tablets unearthed in Iraq during the 19th century contained creation stories so similar to Genesis that scholars were stunned. These weren't vague similarities, but precise parallel narratives. Humans formed from clay, a divine garden, a woman created from a man's rib, a great flood that cleansed the earth, all recorded thousands of years before Moses allegedly received divine inspiration. Blavatsky understood something profound that religious authorities couldn't allow to become public knowledge. These weren't coincidences, but evidence that biblical accounts were edited versions of much older stories featuring multiple gods rather than one. The monotheistic narrative that gave the Vatican its power was built upon the foundation of polytheistic beliefs they claimed to oppose. As we explore deeper into Blavatsky's forbidden revelations, you'll understand why this knowledge was systematically suppressed throughout history. The Vatican's fear wasn't based on protecting humanity from evil. It was about maintaining control over humanity's spiritual narrative. Long before the Bible existed, ancient Mesopotamians were recording their spiritual truths on clay tablets. What they documented challenges everything modern religion claims about originality. These weren't primitive scribbles, but sophisticated accounts of creation, divine beings, and cosmic order that predate biblical stories by thousands of years. When archaeologists unearthed the Royal Library of Nineveh in 1849, they discovered over 20,000 clay tablets containing stories that would shake religious foundations. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, and other texts revealed that stories considered uniquely biblical were actually adapted from much older sources. Helena Blavatsky was among the first to recognize the profound implications of these discoveries. What makes these clay testimonies so threatening to religious authority isn't just their age, but their precision. The Sumerian creation account describes divine beings separating light from darkness, dividing waters, creating humans from clay, and establishing a paradise with 4 rivers, exactly matching Genesis, but written centuries earlier. This wasn't vague similarity, but detailed correspondence that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Blavatsky recognized that these tablets weren't just historical curiosities, but evidence of a deliberate rewriting of spiritual history. The biblical narrative transformed multiple gods, the Anunnaki Council, into a single deity, editing out plurality while preserving the basic storyline. This transformation wasn't divine inspiration, but careful editing of pre-existing mythology. The clay tablets contain something even more threatening to monotheistic control. They describe the Anunnaki not as distant, judgmental deities, but as beings who interacted directly with humans, sharing knowledge and engaging in relationships. This contrasts sharply with the untouchable, unknowable God of later monotheism, who demands blind faith rather than direct experience. What's particularly significant about these tablets is their durability. Unlike fragile scrolls that easily burn or decay, clay tablets survive thousands of years, preserving unaltered accounts that resist editing or destruction. Their survival represents a powerful testimony that couldn't be easily erased by those wishing to control religious narrative. Blavatsky's work connected these ancient testimonies with mystical traditions worldwide, revealing patterns that suggested a common source for humanity's spiritual understanding. These connections threatened the Vatican's claim to unique divine revelation and exclusive spiritual authority. Comente de qual cidade você está assistindo para sabermos até onde esse conhecimento está chegando. Your location matters, because this information has been systematically suppressed in different regions for centuries. Understanding where this knowledge is reaching helps us track how widely these revelations are now spreading, despite historical censorship. But the clay tablets reveal something even more significant that Blavatsky understood all too well. The Anunnaki weren't portrayed as evil tempters, but as complex beings with both wisdom and flaws. This nuanced view of divinity directly contradicted the simplistic good versus evil narrative that gave religious authorities their power. What other explosive revelations did Blavatsky uncover about these ancient beings that made religious authorities tremble? One of Blavatsky's most shocking discoveries involved the transformation of many gods into one. The Sumerian tablets describe the Anunnaki not as a single deity, but as a divine council making collective decisions about humanity's fate. This cosmic parliament of celestial beings directly contradicts monotheism's central claim of a singular creator. When you examine Genesis closely, echoes of this plurality remain visible despite centuries of editing. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. This plural phrasing appears in Genesis 1:26, a linguistic fossil revealing the monotheistic narrative's polytheistic origins. Blavatsky identified numerous such remnants throughout biblical texts, proving they derived from older, multi-deity accounts. The Anunnaki Council described in Sumerian texts functioned as a cosmic democracy, where major decisions required collective agreement. Creation itself wasn't the act of a single all-powerful being, but the result of deliberation, compromise, and shared purpose among various divine entities. This democratic vision of divinity threatened hierarchical religious power structures that required an unquestionable singular authority. Blavatsky's analysis revealed that monotheism's rise wasn't just a theological evolution, but a political transformation. Centralized religious authority requires a single, absolute divine reference point. Multiple gods with different perspectives allow for interpretation and questioning. One supreme deity demands absolute obedience. The shift from many to one mirrors the consolidation of earthly power. The tablets describe how the Anunnaki Council debated humanity's fate, with some advocating destruction, while others argued for preservation. This complex moral deliberation contrasts sharply with the unilateral decisions of the biblical God. Plurality allows for dissent, discussion, and evolution of thought, all dangerous concepts for institutions requiring unwavering adherence to established doctrine. What remains particularly threatening about this revelation is how it demystifies religious authority. If divine will emerges from council debate rather than absolute dictate, then human interpretation gains legitimacy. Blavatsky understood that acknowledging the divine council would fundamentally undermine claims of exclusive religious authority based on direct divine mandate. The transformation from many voices to one wasn't merely theological, but fundamentally political. Monotheism provided the perfect model for centralized control, a single unquestionable authority figure whose commands must be obeyed without debate. The plural Anunnaki Council represented a dangerous alternative paradigm where authority was shared, decisions were debated, and multiple perspectives held validity. When religious authorities suppressed knowledge of the Anunnaki, they weren't just hiding historical curiosities, but concealing an entirely different model of cosmic governance that threatened their control. The plural us and our that occasionally appear in biblical texts aren't minor grammatical anomalies, but revelatory glimpses of the original plural divine narrative that monotheism attempted to overwrite. But perhaps most threatening of all was how the Anunnaki Council's deliberations revealed something the Vatican couldn't allow. That divinity itself could contain uncertainty, debate, and evolution. What other cosmic secrets did Blavatsky uncover that completely transform our understanding of humanity's true spiritual heritage? Helena Blavatsky's research revealed the most controversial truth about human origins. According to ancient Sumerian texts, humans weren't divinely manifested through pure spiritual will, but deliberately engineered by the Anunnaki for specific purposes. This account of creation differs radically from religious doctrine and aligns more closely with modern genetic understanding. The Sumerian creation accounts describe the Anunnaki mixing clay with divine essence to create functional human workers. This wasn't poetic metaphor, but detailed description of genetic manipulation, combining earthly elements with their own biological material. Blavatsky recognized this as a scientific process described through the limited technological vocabulary available to ancient cultures. What makes this account particularly threatening to religious authorities is its pragmatic nature. According to Sumerian texts, humans weren't created as perfect spiritual beings who fell from grace, but as deliberate biological hybrids designed for labor. The biblical creation story transforms this engineering project into a spiritual narrative, obscuring the technological implications of humanity's origins. Blavatsky identified striking parallels between the Sumerian creation account and biblical Genesis. Both describe humans formed from earth jar clay. Both involve divine breath jar essence entering physical form. Both place humans in a garden paradise. The differences reveal deliberate editing. Genesis removes plurality, transforms creation from engineering to magic, and adds moral dimensions absent from the original. The original Sumerian account describes multiple experimental attempts at creating functional humans, with some versions failing before the final successful model emerged. This trial-and-error approach directly contradicts the narrative of perfect divine creation. It suggests a technological rather than magical process, with improvements made through successive iterations. Exactly what we would expect from advanced beings using genetic engineering. Perhaps most threatening to religious doctrine was the Sumerian explanation for humanity's special qualities. According to these ancient texts, humans possess divine-like awareness because they literally contain Anunnaki genetic material. Our intelligence, creativity, and spiritual capacity aren't miraculous gifts, but inherited biological traits from our creators. This materialist explanation undermines the entire concept of spiritual exceptionalism that religions require. Blavatsky understood that these ancient accounts described something modern science would eventually confirm, that human DNA contains unexplained complexities and apparent leaps that differentiate us from other Earth species. The Sumerian explanation for these anomalies predates modern genetics by thousands of years, yet aligns remarkably well with current questions about human evolutionary development. For religious authorities, this version of creation represented an existential threat. If humans were engineered rather than divinely manifested, if our creation involved trial and error rather than perfect design, if our spiritual capacity results from genetic inheritance rather than divine blessing, then the entire foundation of religious authority crumbles. No wonder the Vatican feared these ancient accounts more than any demon. But the most revolutionary aspect of this creation account is what it reveals about human potential. If we contain Anunnaki genetics, if we are partially divine by biological inheritance rather than spiritual blessing, then our capabilities may far exceed what religious authorities have allowed us to believe. What other truths about human potential did Blavatsky uncover that religious authorities couldn't allow people to know? Blavatsky discovered that the Garden of Eden wasn't the original paradise, but a simplified retelling of much older accounts. The Sumerian texts describe a place called Dilman, A divine garden where sickness and death didn't exist, where pure rivers flowed, and where the Anunnaki themselves walked among early humans. This original paradise contains elements that were deliberately removed from later biblical accounts. What makes the Sumerian paradise particularly significant is its location. Unlike the abstract mythical Eden, Dilman was described as a real place at the junction of major rivers, potentially identifiable in the Persian Gulf region. Blavatsky recognized that transforming a physical location into a purely spiritual metaphor served to disconnect humanity from tangible evidence of our interactions with the Anunnaki. The most striking difference between Dilman and Eden lies in their fundamental purpose. Dilman was described as a biological research center, where the Anunnaki conducted their genetic work and taught early humans various skills and knowledge. Eden, by contrast, becomes a moral testing ground, where obedience matters more than growth or learning. This transformation shifts focus from knowledge acquisition to obedience training. Blavatsky noted that the famous tree of knowledge in Eden directly inverts the Sumerian account, where knowledge was freely shared by certain Anunnaki with their human creations. The biblical transformation of knowledge from gift to forbidden fruit represents a profound shift in spiritual paradigm, from empowerment to restriction, from growth to control. The serpent figure undergoes a similar transformation between these accounts. In Sumerian mythology, serpent symbols represented wisdom, healing, and transformation, positive associations with knowledge and advancement. The biblical conversion of the serpent into a tempter and deceiver directly inverts this symbolism, transforming the pursuit of knowledge from virtue to sin. If you've been experiencing unexplained spiritual awakenings or unusual dreams about ancient knowledge, this is why. Many people are beginning to reconnect with these original truths as collective consciousness expands beyond religious programming. Your intuition that something about the official narrative doesn't add up is completely valid. The Dilman account contains something completely absent from Eden: descriptions of the Anunnaki teaching humans various arts, sciences, and spiritual practices. The biblical Eden removes all technology transfer and divine education, replacing it with a single rule about forbidden knowledge. This editing eliminates the entire concept of beneficial knowledge transfer from advanced beings to humanity. For religious authorities, the original paradise paradigm threatened their position as exclusive knowledge brokers. If the Anunnaki directly educated early humans, if paradise involved knowledge expansion rather than obedience testing, if the serpent represented wisdom rather than temptation, then religious institutions lose their claim to be humanity's necessary intermediaries with the divine. Blavatsky understood that these contrasting paradise accounts represent fundamentally different visions of spirituality. The Sumerian version emphasizes growth through knowledge acquisition. The biblical version emphasizes virtue through obedience. This transformation from growth paradigm to control paradigm served specific theological and political purposes that maintained religious authority. What other fundamental spiritual principles were inverted when ancient accounts were transformed into religious doctrine? The next revelation completely transforms our understanding of humanity's greatest catastrophe. Helena Blavatsky uncovered evidence that the biblical flood story originated from much older Sumerian accounts, describing global catastrophe. The Sumerian hero Utnapishtim, later called Atrahasis, survived the same devastating flood that would later feature Noah, complete with an ark, animal preservation, and divine warning. But the original reason for this catastrophe differs dramatically from later religious interpretations. According to Sumerian texts, the flood wasn't divine punishment for human sin, but resulted from conflict among the Anunnaki themselves. Some council members felt humans had become too numerous and noisy, disrupting their comfort. Others objected to this genocide plan but were outvoted. This portrayal of divine beings as irritated, conflicted, and capable of genocidal overreaction stands in sharp contrast to the morally righteous biblical God. Blavatsky noted that transforming the flood from divine temper tantrum to righteous moral judgment served obvious theological purposes. It's far easier to worship a deity who punishes evil than one who destroys humans for being annoying. The biblical reframing shifts blame from divine petulance to human wickedness, completely inverting the moral dynamics of the original account. What remains particularly striking in both accounts is the selective nature of salvation. In both the Sumerian and biblical versions, divine beings warn a chosen individual while allowing the rest of humanity to perish. This selective salvation pattern appears repeatedly throughout religious narratives, reinforcing the concept that divine favor is limited to the specially chosen rather than universally available. The Sumerian flood account contains technological details absent from the biblical version. The dimensions and construction methods for the ark are precisely specified, suggesting practical instructions rather than symbolic storytelling. Blavatsky recognized these specific measurements and materials as potential evidence of actual historical events rather than purely symbolic mythology. Perhaps most significantly, the Sumerian flood story doesn't end with a divine covenant or rainbow promise. Instead, it concludes with the Anunnaki Council implementing population control measures to prevent humans from becoming too numerous again. This pragmatic approach contrasts sharply with the biblical transformation into a moral parable with divine promises. Flood myths appear in nearly every ancient culture worldwide, from China to Greece, from India to Mesoamerica. Blavatsky recognized that this global distribution suggests either cultural diffusion from a common source or multiple accounts of the same actual event. Either explanation threatens the uniqueness claims of biblical narrative and suggests a shared human experience predating religious divisions. The Vatican couldn't acknowledge these parallel flood accounts because they reveal the biblical story as one version among many rather than unique divine revelation. This pattern of adapted mythology appears consistently throughout religious texts, suggesting systematic transformation of older polytheistic accounts into monotheistic narratives serving specific theological and political purposes. Blavatsky understood that these parallel catastrophe accounts reveal something profound about human spiritual history. Our ancestral memory preserves traumatic events across millennia, but religious interpretation transforms shared trauma into moral parables that reinforce specific power structures. This pattern of reframing collective memory into religious doctrine appears consistently throughout human spiritual history. What other global catastrophes might be preserved in our ancestral memory? How might understanding these shared traumatic events transform our understanding of both human history and spiritual development? The next revelation connects these ancient accounts directly to modern experience in ways that will fundamentally transform your understanding of reality. One of Blavatsky's most explosive discoveries involved ancient accounts of direct genetic mixing between Anunnaki and humans. The Sumerian texts describe beings called the Igigi, younger Anunnaki, who found human females attractive and produced hybrid offspring with enhanced abilities and extended lifespans. This account appears in biblical texts as the mysterious Nephilim, sons of God who mated with daughters of men. What makes this bloodline account particularly threatening to religious authorities is its implication for human potential. If some humans carry additional Anunnaki genetic material through these ancient hybridization events, then spiritual capacity might be biologically inherited rather than spiritually granted. This directly undermines religious claims that spiritual authority comes exclusively through divine selection or institutional approval. Blavatsky connected these ancient accounts with worldwide traditions of star people, sky gods, and royal bloodlines claiming divine ancestry. From Egyptian pharaohs to Incan kings, from Japanese emperors to European royalty, ruling classes throughout history have claimed special divine heritage that justified their authority. These parallel claims across isolated cultures suggest either common mythological development or actual shared experience. The biblical treatment of these hybrid bloodlines is particularly revealing. Genesis briefly acknowledges these beings. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. However, these hybrid beings are immediately connected with wickedness and the justification for the flood, transforming a genetic account into a moral condemnation. What's particularly significant is how these hybrid beings are described in original Sumerian texts as cultural heroes who taught humans advanced knowledge in astronomy, metallurgy, medicine, and spiritual practices. This positive portrayal directly contradicts the biblical transformation of these same figures into wicked giants whose existence justified divine punishment. Blavatsky recognized that these bloodline accounts might explain the emergence of advanced civilizations that appear fully formed in the archaeological record without clear developmental stages. The sudden appearance of sophisticated astronomical knowledge, mathematics, agriculture, and architecture in early Sumer, Egypt, and other regions might reflect direct knowledge transfer from advanced beings rather than gradual human development. If you've always felt different, more sensitive to energy, more questioning of authority, more connected to something beyond conventional reality, this ancient knowledge explains why. Many people alive today carry activated genetic memory, connecting them to these original truths despite centuries of suppression. Your intuitive knowing isn't imagination, but genetic memory awakening. For religious authorities, these bloodline accounts represent an existential threat. If spiritual capacity and knowledge can be biologically inherited rather than institutionally granted, their position as necessary intermediaries collapses. The transformation of beneficial hybrid beings into wicked giants deserving punishment serves to delegitimize any claims of special heritage outside approved religious channels. The most significant aspect of these bloodline accounts is their democratization in modern times. While ancient traditions restricted divine heritage claims to ruling elites, Blavatsky's work suggested that many humans might carry some degree of Anunnaki genetics, explaining the widespread spiritual awakening occurring globally despite institutional resistance. What if your unique sensitivities, perspectives, and abilities aren't random but reflect your own celestial heritage? The next revelation explains why certain spiritual practices have been systematically suppressed throughout history, despite their transformative power. Helena Blavatsky uncovered evidence that the Anunnaki shared advanced technologies and spiritual practices with early humans, knowledge that was later reframed as dangerous, forbidden, or sinful. The Sumerian texts describe specific Anunnaki individuals teaching humans writing, astronomy, agriculture, metallurgy, medicine, and spiritual practices for expanding consciousness. What makes these knowledge transfer accounts particularly significant is their consistent suppression throughout religious history. The biblical transformation of knowledge from divine gift to forbidden fruit represents the most obvious example, but similar patterns appear across cultures where priestly classes restricted access to specific practices while claiming exclusive authority over others. Blavatsky identified striking parallels between ancient spiritual technologies described in Sumerian texts and practices preserved in mystery traditions worldwide, from Hermetic techniques to Vedic practices, from shamanic methods to esoteric Christianity. These parallel practices suggest preservation of a common source tradition despite mainstream religious suppression. The ancient texts describe specific meditation techniques, breathing practices, and energy work methods taught by the Anunnaki for awakening human spiritual potential. These closely resemble practices preserved in yoga traditions, Taoist methods, and various esoteric systems. Blavatsky recognized these similarities as evidence of common origin rather than coincidental development. Perhaps most controversial was Blavatsky's discovery that ancient texts describe technologies for communicating directly with the Anunnaki through consciousness expansion rather than external worship. These direct communication methods threatened religious authority by eliminating the need for institutional intermediaries between humans and divine beings. Have you noticed how the same spiritual technologies appear across different traditions worldwide, despite historical separation? This pattern of parallel development suggests preservation of common source knowledge rather than independent discovery. The consistency of these techniques across cultures validates their effectiveness despite religious suppression. For religious authorities, these accounts of direct knowledge transfer represent an existential threat. If the Anunnaki freely shared knowledge with humans, if direct communication remains possible through specific practices, if spiritual technology exists independent of religious approval, then institutional authority becomes unnecessary. No wonder these accounts were systematically suppressed. Blavatsky's work connected these ancient technologies with contemporary scientific discoveries, suggesting that modern humans might rediscover and validate practices described in ancient texts. This convergence of ancient wisdom with modern science creates possibilities for spiritual development outside traditional religious frameworks, further threatening established authority structures. The transformation of knowledge from gift to sin, from enlightenment to danger, from connection to transgression represents perhaps the most significant inversion in religious history. By reframing the pursuit of knowledge as disobedience rather than growth, religious institutions positioned themselves as necessary protection against dangerous wisdom rather than obstacles to spiritual development. What suppressed technologies might accelerate your own spiritual awakening if you applied them consistently? The final revelations will connect everything we've explored into a comprehensive understanding of why the Vatican feared the Anunnaki more than any demon or devil. Blavatsky discovered evidence suggesting the Vatican's secret archives contain extensive documentation of humanity's relationship with the Anunnaki. These hidden collections reportedly include original Sumerian tablets, pre-biblical manuscripts, and documentation of ongoing Anunnaki influence throughout human history. The systematic concealment of these materials reveals institutional awareness of truths too dangerous for public knowledge. According to Blavatsky's research, the Vatican specifically targeted and collected materials relating to the Anunnaki during medieval crusades, inquisitions, and colonial expansions. What appeared as religious persecution often functioned as knowledge confiscation, with rare texts and artifacts flowing into secret repositories rather than being destroyed as commonly believed. The secret archives reportedly contain detailed maps of ancient sites associated with Anunnaki activity, comprehensive translations of Sumerian and pre-Sumerian texts, and documentation of bloodline connections between ancient and modern families. This collection represents the world's most complete record of human Anunnaki interactions, systematically hidden from public knowledge. Blavatsky uncovered accounts of specialized Vatican departments dedicated to monitoring and suppressing information about the Anunnaki throughout history. These operations involved identifying and acquiring ancient artifacts, surveilling individuals who discovered relevant information, and carefully managing public narratives about archaeological findings that might reveal unwanted truths. What makes these secret collections particularly significant is their systematic organization. Unlike random accumulation, the Vatican archives reportedly categorize Anunnaki-related materials chronologically and geographically, documenting patterns of influence across different cultures and time periods. This organizational structure suggests institutional recognition of these beings' historical reality, despite public denial. The archives reportedly include documentation of ongoing Anunnaki influence throughout recorded history, not as distant myths, but as continued interactions with human civilization. These records track specific Anunnaki-associated bloodlines, architectural sites, and knowledge transmissions across centuries, revealing patterns invisible to conventional historical analysis. If you've noticed how archaeology consistently suppresses or reinterprets findings that don't match established historical narratives, this explains why. Discoveries contradicting official timelines or suggesting advanced ancient knowledge are routinely dismissed, classified, or reframed to maintain control over humanity's understanding of our own origins. For religious authorities, these archives serve dual purposes: preserving crucial knowledge while preventing public access to information that would undermine institutional authority. This pattern of controlled knowledge hoarding appears consistently throughout religious history, with institutions simultaneously denying and documenting realities beyond their official doctrines. Blavatsky's most controversial claim involved Vatican awareness of continued Anunnaki presence and activity in modern times. The archives reportedly document specific locations, individuals, and events associated with ongoing Anunnaki influence, revealing institutional monitoring of phenomena publicly dismissed as myth or conspiracy theory. What truths about humanity's relationship with advanced beings might be confirmed if these archives were open to public scrutiny? The final revelation integrates everything we've explored into a comprehensive understanding of why religious authorities fear these ancient beings more than any conventional devil. Helena Blavatsky's most profound discovery wasn't just historical, but fundamentally transformative. The Vatican fears the Anunnaki because acknowledging their existence would completely dismantle religious authority structures. These beings represent not evil to be feared, but truth too revolutionary to be embraced. The reality that humanity has never been alone and never needed institutional intermediaries for spiritual connection. The Anunnaki accounts reveal something religious institutions cannot allow: that spirituality itself was never meant to be controlled by hierarchical organizations, but freely available through direct connection. The original Sumerian texts describe specific Anunnaki individuals who advocated for human spiritual autonomy against others who preferred human subservience. This internal conflict among advanced beings directly contradicts the unified divine narrative required for religious control. What makes Blavatsky's revelations particularly powerful today is their alignment with contemporary awakening. Millions worldwide report expanded consciousness, spiritual experiences outside religious frameworks, and intuitive understanding of realities beyond materialist explanations. These experiences match exactly what ancient texts describe as humanity's birthright: direct spiritual connection without institutional mediation. The transformation of plural, interactive, knowledge-sharing Anunnaki into a singular, distant, rule-giving God represents the most significant spiritual revisionism in human history. This editing served specific control purposes, replacing direct experience with required belief, replacing knowledge pursuit with obedience training, replacing spiritual technology with religious ritual. Blavatsky recognized this pattern across multiple traditions worldwide. For religious authorities, the most dangerous aspect of the Anunnaki accounts isn't their historical contradiction of biblical narrative, but their invitation to spiritual self-determination. If advanced beings once freely shared knowledge, if direct communication remains possible through consciousness expansion, if spiritual capacity derives from inherent qualities rather than institutional blessing, then religious authority becomes not just unnecessary, but obstructive. Your own spiritual awakening isn't random coincidence, but reconnection with capacities humans have always possessed. The feelings of expanded awareness, inexplicable knowing, and connection to something beyond material reality that many experience today represent activation of dormant potential that religious institutions have systematically suppressed throughout history. Blavatsky understood that the conflict between institutional religion and direct spiritual experience wasn't just theological but fundamentally about authority and control. By transforming interactive relationships with advanced beings into submission to a singular deity, by converting knowledge pursuit into potential sin, religious institutions position themselves as necessary protection against dangerous spiritual autonomy. The ultimate revelation isn't that ancient texts describe advanced beings who shaped human development. It's that these accounts reveal spiritual authority as constructed rather than divinely ordained. The transformation of plural, complex, interactive Anunnaki into a singular, perfect, distant God served specific control purposes that religious institutions cannot survive without maintaining. This knowledge isn't meant to destroy faith, but to liberate it from institutional constraints. Understanding the original context of spiritual traditions allows reconnection with their transformative essence beyond dogmatic limitations. Blavatsky's work ultimately points toward spiritual integration rather than institutional dependence, direct experience rather than required belief. If this information resonates with your own intuitive understanding, share it with others awakening to similar realizations. Comment below with your experiences of spiritual connection beyond traditional frameworks. Subscribe to continue exploring these transformative truths. The knowledge Helena Blavatsky risked everything to preserve now spreads worldwide, despite centuries of suppression, revealing not just where we came from but what we might become when liberated from artificial spiritual limitations.